a video game or something from the... hold on, this is my ringtone. It's the hustle. Do the hustle.
It began with a headline no one anticipated and few could immediately verify, yet almost everyone felt compelled to read. A line flashing across phones and laptops that suggested a rupture in a story long sustained by silence. Amelia Warner's explosive words to Dakota Johnson revealed, and within minutes the claims spread with the peculiar velocity reserved for modern scandal, fueled by screenshots of dubious origin, breathless whispers attributed to unnamed sources, and talk of an alleged confrontation that threatened to disturb Hollywood's carefully maintained calm. Because for years Amelia had been known not merely as Jamie Dornan's wife, but as the embodiment of quiet composure, elegant and restrained. A woman who stood beside her husband without ever stepping into the glare that followed him, refusing interviews that might invite speculation, declining to dignify gossip with reaction, and enduring with remarkable dignity the endless commentary surrounding his on-screen partnership with Dakota Johnson, particularly during the height of the 50 Shades phenomenon, when their chemistry became a subject of obsession and their every interaction was mined for meaning. Yet even the most patient silence has its limits, and according to those close to the situation, Amelia's breaking point arrived not through a single dramatic event but through accumulation. Years of restraint finally pressed too far when Dakota, during a recent press tour for a new film, spoke once again about Jamie in a way that felt, to some ears, less reflective and more possessive than before. The moment itself seemed innocuous at first, almost routine, as Dakota was asked a familiar question about her chemistry with Jamie, one she had fielded countless times with ease, usually deflecting with humor and well-worn remarks about professionalism, trust, and mutual respect. But this time she added something that landed differently, her tone softer, her words more intimate, saying that she would always have a special connection with Jamie, that what they had shared on set did not fade but stayed somewhere inside you. And while the audience applauded and the interviewer smiled politely, the internet stalled for a brief, electric second before erupting, as clips were clipped, captions sharpened, and narratives formed almost instantly, declaring Dakota still in love with Jamie, speculating about Amelia's reaction, and transforming a reflective comment into a perceived provocation. And at first, Amelia did what she had always done. She ignored it, choosing once again to trust the solidity of the life she and Jamie had built together. A life rooted in shared values, children, and the unremarkable but sustaining routines of domestic reality, far removed from premieres and press junkets. Yet this time the noise felt closer, sharper, perhaps because the comment itself seemed to breathe life back into a story Amelia had spent years watching others tell on her behalf. Or perhaps because fans, emboldened by the clip, began tagging her directly, daring her to respond, inviting her into a conversation she had never consented to join, and whatever the precise catalyst, something shifted within her. Not in a flash of rage but in a quieter, more resolute way, as exhaustion replaced patience and politeness gave way to the need for boundaries. A friend of the couple later suggested that Amelia did not feel threatened so much as disrespected, not because Dakota had mentioned Jamie, but because she had spoken as though their bond remained alive in a way that seemed to encroach upon the present. And according to insiders, Amelia initially chose the most private and measured path available to her, reaching out discreetly through appropriate channels, not with accusations or hostility but with honesty, asking Dakota to refrain from invoking Jamie in public narratives, to respect the life he had built beyond the films that had long since concluded. Yet when no response came, or when the absence of response itself became its own form of answer, Amelia reached the conclusion that silence, once her shield, had become inadequate, and the message she reportedly sent through a mutual acquaintance was brief, precise, and devastating in its clarity, stating simply that Dakota had had her time with him on screen and should now allow him to live off screen in peace, a sentence that carried neither insult nor threat yet resonated with the authority of someone reclaiming the right to define her own reality, and whether by accident or intent the message did not remain private, leaking into the public domain within hours and confirming to the world that Amelia Warner, long defined by what she did not say, had finally spoken. The reaction was immediate and polarized, with some praising her as a woman defending her family and others accusing her of insecurity, as though the only possible motivations were rivalry or fear. Yet those closest to Amelia insisted the truth was far simpler and far more human. that she was not fighting another woman so much as resisting a narrative that had pursued her husband for nearly a decade, a story that reduced him to a single on-screen dynamic and her to a silent footnote. And inside their London home, Jamie found himself in the uncomfortable position of mediator, caught between a past that refused to stay in the past and a present he was determined to protect, attempting to call Dakota in hopes of clearing the air only to find the call unanswered, and returning instead to Amelia, who was not angry in the explosive sense but quietly resolute, telling him that she wanted the comparisons to stop, that she wanted to wake up without seeing their marriage measured against a fictional romance, that she wanted the world to remember he was more than the role that had defined him for strangers. And hearing this, Jamie reportedly felt a familiar pang of guilt, realizing anew how much Amelia had carried without complaint, how often she had sought dignity over defense, and how heavy that choice had been over time. In the days that followed, the media dissected everything with relentless enthusiasm, replaying Dakota's interview alongside the alleged message, analyzing tone, timing, and subtext, debating whether Amelia had crossed a line or Dakota had done so first, framing Jamie as a man perpetually suspended between two worlds. And for audiences it was spectacle, another chapter in Hollywood's endless soap opera, while for Amelia it was simply wearying, prompting her to withdraw further from the noise, stepping back from social media, disengaging from commentary. Yet paradoxically, the story only grew louder, now recast as the moment a woman finally spoke her truth after years of restraint. And those who knew her well suggested that was precisely what it was, not an outburst but an ending, the conclusion of a long period of self-silencing undertaken for the sake of peace. Because Amelia was not angry, she was finished. Finished being polite while her boundaries were tested. Finished pretending words carried no weight. Finished allowing others to narrate her marriage as though it were public property. And in that sense, the moment marked a shift not only for her but for everyone involved. Because the illusion that had lingered for years, sustained by ambiguity and nostalgia, finally met resistance grounded in lived reality. For Jamie, the episode served as a reckoning, forcing him to confront the unintended consequences of a role that had brought success but also shadows. And while he had never encouraged speculation, he had perhaps underestimated how persistent it could be, how deeply it could intrude into the private lives of those he loved. And for Dakota, though she did not publicly respond beyond measured professionalism, the message reportedly prompted reflection on the boundaries between past and present, between fond remembrance and public implication. And gradually, as weeks passed, the frenzy subsided, not because a definitive truth had been established, but because the emotional center of the story had shifted, away from imagined rivalries and back towards the reality of a marriage asserting its right to exist without commentary. And in that sense, Amelia's words, calm yet firm, achieved what years of silence had not, puncturing the fantasy and reminding observers that behind every projected narrative are real people navigating the consequences. And though the internet moved on as it always does, chasing new headlines and fresh intrigue, something lingered beneath the surface, a recognition that composure does not equate to consent, that patience has limits, and that sometimes the most powerful statement is not dramatic or cruel but simply clear, spoken once and without apology. And for the first time, the woman long perceived as the quiet presence in the background stepped briefly into focus, not to perform or persuade, but to reclaim authorship of her own story, leaving behind not scandal but a recalibration of where the line between public fascination and private life must finally be drawn.
Number?
49.
She had stayed silent for years, but that silence had never meant absence or weakness. It had been deliberate, chosen, a form of quiet authorship over her own life. And when it finally broke, it was not merely a reaction but a rewriting of the story itself, because the stillness that followed Amelia Warner's words proved louder than any headline that had preceded them. And when the sentence surfaced online, "You've had your time with him on screen. Please let him live off screen in peace," the usual machinery of celebrity gossip seemed, for a rare moment, to hesitate, reporters pausing their endlessly recycled segments, commentators lowering their voices, even fans who thrived on speculation holding their breath as if they instinctively recognized that this was not a dramatic soundbite engineered for attention but a rupture, a clean incision through years of politeness, restraint, and emotional labor that exposed something unmistakably human beneath the gloss of Hollywood narrative. And at the center of it all stood Jamie Dornan, suddenly caught in a storm he had never sought. His phone lighting up relentlessly with messages from publicists, colleagues, friends, people asking not what had happened but how he would respond. Yet for days he chose not to, retreating instead into the private space of his home with Amelia, navigating an unfamiliar tension that was not born of anger but of fatigue. The awkwardness of two people, confronting the accumulated weight of something they had long pretended did not exist. And Jamie understood her more than the world ever could, understanding that her words had not come from jealousy or insecurity but from years of watching her marriage be treated as a footnote to a fictional romance. Yet he also knew that Dakota would be hurt, because intentions rarely shield against impact. Dakota Johnson, meanwhile, remained conspicuously quiet, and the world, conditioned by cycles of escalation and rebuttal, waited for retaliation in the EXP. Forms, a pointed interview, a defensive statement, a carefully worded post designed to reclaim narrative control, but none came, and it was not until a week later, beneath the chandeliers of a charity gala in Los Angeles, that she was finally asked directly for comment. A reporter approaching her with measured caution, and in that moment Dakota paused, inhaled slowly, and answered not with defensiveness but with restraint, acknowledging that Amelia had every right to protect her world, admitting softly that she had never intended to hurt anyone, that sometimes words emerge imperfectly, but that there was nothing but respect between them, and the tone of that response, calm and unembellished, shifted the atmosphere almost immediately, recasting the story from one of rivalry into something more nuanced and adult, dividing the internet into camps not of outrage but of alignment, some praising Dakota's composure, others standing firmly behind Amelia's boundary setting. Yet, beneath the public debate, something quieter and far more consequential unfolded away from cameras and comment sections. According to sources close to the situation, Jamie reached out to Dakota the following day, a conversation that was not lengthy but heavy with years of unspoken context, and he apologized not for Amelia's words but for the blurred lines of the past, for the way ambiguity and silence had allowed misunderstanding to calcify into myth, and Dakota, ever perceptive, responded with understanding rather than resentment, reminding him that the world struggles to recognize platonic connection or professional intimacy, preferring instead the drama of imagined romance. And yet even as external tensions softened, Amelia found herself unable to fully release the weight she had been carrying, because she had never intended to start a war. She had wanted peace, and peace in Hollywood is rarely granted without collateral damage. And one evening Jamie found her sitting alone in the garden, the city's distant lights casting a muted glow as she stared outward, and when he sat beside her in silence she finally asked the question that had been hovering between them, whether he ever wished it had all been different, the films, the attention, the way people continued to speak of him and Dakota as though she herself were merely an epilogue rather than the center of his present life. And Jamie, placing his hand over hers, admitted that he could not change what people chose to believe, but he could choose what he affirmed publicly and privately, promising to make it unmistakably clear who he had chosen, to which Amelia replied not with reassurance but with resolve, telling him simply to start showing them, words that struck deeper than any rumor because they demanded action rather than defense. The following morning Jamie released a rare statement through his publicist, notable not for its polish but for its simplicity, its refusal to perform outrage or engage in correction, instead offering something vulnerable and direct, acknowledging that much had been said that missed the truth, affirming Amelia's strength and grace through things no one had ever seen, stating plainly that he owed her peace rather than headlines, and clarifying that while he and Dakota had shared an important experience as actors, that chapter had closed years ago, and that what mattered now was family, honesty, and respect. And within minutes the message traveled across platforms not as fuel for further scandal, but as a moment of collective exhale, fans responding with admiration rather than frenzy, praising the clarity and maturity of a response that felt refreshingly unmanufactured. Even Dakota's supporters acknowledging the dignity with which the situation had been handled, calling it one of the rare instances where Hollywood drama resolved not through spectacle but through accountability. Later that week Amelia and Jamie were photographed attending a small charity event in London, walking hand in hand without performance or affectation, not posing for cameras so much as existing alongside one another, and the image resonated precisely because it lacked theatricality, their closeness speaking more convincingly than any statement ever could. Yet behind that composed exterior, Amelia carried a truth few fully grasped, that her frustration had never truly been about Dakota as an individual but about the broader intrusion of fame into something she considered sacred. The endless comparisons, the reduction of a real marriage to an accessory of a cinematic fantasy. And for years she had swallowed those intrusions quietly, believing that dignity lay in endurance, until she realized that silence, though noble, can also be misinterpreted as permission. And when a friend later asked whether she regretted her words, she answered without hesitation that she did not, only wishing she had never been placed in a position where speaking was necessary at all. Dakota, for her part, offered no further commentary, but quietly liked Jamie's statement on social media, a gesture small enough to escape headlines yet meaningful enough to signal closure, a recognition that some chapters are best ended not with explanation but with acceptance. And by the end of the month, the storm that had once seemed all-consuming had dissipated, headlines moving on as they inevitably do, gossip cooling, and for once the names Jamie, Amelia, and Dakota were no longer entwined in chaos but aligned, if loosely, in understanding. And within an industry sustained by illusion, they had each confronted the same difficult truth, that authenticity often arrives only after rupture, that boundaries must sometimes be drawn allowed to be respected, and that what appears explosive on the surface may in fact be an act of preservation. And though Amelia's words had initially sounded sharp, even furious to some, in retrospect they revealed themselves as something far purer, the sound of a woman refusing to allow. After years of choosing silence, Amelia Warner finally drew a boundary that rewrote the narrative surrounding her marriage, and the stillness that followed her words proved more powerful than any headline could have been. Because when her message surfaced online asking that Jamie Dornan be allowed to live his life away from the screen, it cut cleanly through years of speculation and polite restraint, forcing both the media and the public to pause. Jamie, caught between public expectation and private loyalty, chose not to respond immediately, retreating instead into the quiet reality of home, where understanding rather than anger defined his response, even as he recognized the hurt the situation might cause others. Dakota Johnson's measured acknowledgement days later, offered without defensiveness, shifted the tone of the conversation, revealing a rare moment of maturity in a culture that thrives on escalation. When Jamie eventually spoke, his words were simple and sincere, affirming his commitment to his wife and closing the chapter that had long been left ajar by silence. The public reaction, unexpectedly gentle, reflected a collective recognition that this was not a scandal, but a boundary finally made visible. In stepping out of silence, Amelia was not seeking confrontation but peace, reminding everyone that behind fame and fantasy lie real lives, deserving of pride.